The drawing-room at Ashwick Hall had not been prepared for her arrival. That much was plain in the way the housekeeper, Mrs. Portman, fumbled with the candelabra in the vestibule. In the half-shuttered windows that still held the chill of an April morning and the absence of any fire in the grate, despite the cold that pressed against the stone walls of the house, as if it had been waiting to enter for a very long time, Cecily Vane stood just inside the doorway with her one portmanteau at her feet and her hands folded against the front of her traveling coat, and she breathed in the smell of beeswax and old timber and the particular silence of a house in which no one laughed very often, and she told herself that she had known worse things. She had known her father's study on the morning of the 23rd of November, for instance, when the solicitor, Mr. Throckton, had laid the debt schedule across the desk with the careful movements of a man delivering a verdict. £1,400. She had stood with her back against the bookcase and listened to her father's breathing change, and she had thought that this was the room where everything stops. It had merely taken a different shape. The Earl of Ashwick would accept the full cancellation of the Vane debt in exchange for a marriage contract with the eldest Vane daughter. That was what Mr. Throckton had said, and those were the words that Cecily had carried in her coat pocket for the 3 days of the journey from her father's house in Derbyshire to the Earl's estate in Somerset, folded as carefully as a letter one does not wish to read again, but cannot bring oneself to burn. She had been told that the Earl was cold. She had been told that he was precise, formal, and unwilling to suffer fools. Her father's solicitor had described the man in terms that suggested a piece of furniture, expensive and unyielding, designed for a particular function and not for comfort. Lady Portis, her mother's nearest remaining friend, had pressed Cecily's hand at the gate of Vane House and said, with the blunt sympathy of someone who had herself survived an arranged marriage, "You will manage. You are sensible. The sensible ones always manage." Cecily had not asked what the sensible ones managed to feel. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a man whose optimism had outlived his income by 7 years, and she had arrived at Ashwick Hall on the 8th of April in the year 1817. With her plainest gowns and her dead mother's garnet earrings, and the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from having decided not to spend one's small reserves on panic. Mrs. Portman led her through a corridor lined with landscapes in dark frames, and then stopped before a pair of mahogany doors. She knocked once. The sound it produced was authoritative, as if the house itself were clearing its throat. The man who turned from the window when she entered was not what she had assembled in her imagination during 3 days of road travel. He was perhaps 35, though something in his bearing made the age difficult to place with certainty. Tall, with the kind of frame that suggested neither vanity nor negligence, but simply the body of someone who had never made a performance of himself. His hair was dark brown, cut without flourish, slightly longer than fashion, entirely approved of. His face was a thing of clean lines and careful economy. A jaw that could have been thought severe, if not for the eyes, which were a pale, steady gray, and which were at this precise moment looking at her with an attention so complete and so devoid of assessment that Cecily's first irrational thought was that she had interrupted him at something private. He said, "Miss Vane." The 2 words were level. Not warm, not cold. A statement of fact, delivered by a man who preferred facts. "My lord," she said. He crossed the room and offered her a chair beside the fire, which had been laid but not lit. He lit it himself, kneeling to touch the taper to the kindling with the deliberate movements of someone who did not consider such a task below him. And Cecily watched the side of his face in profile and understood, with a precision that unsettled her, that he was not what she had expected. She would think it many times in the weeks that followed. She would not yet know what to do with the thought. If you find yourself drawn into Cecily's world, you are not alone. Stay with her a little longer. She had expected coldness of a certain character, the formal distance of a man who has purchased a convenience and means to keep the transaction tidy. What she encountered instead was something more disorienting. The Earl of Ashwick, whose name was Edmund Ravel, was quiet. He was quiet in the way of someone who had learned that speech could be used to conceal as readily as to communicate, and who had therefore decided to use it sparingly and only when he meant it. At their first dinner, which was served in a dining room built for 30 and occupied by 2, he asked her what she had read on the journey. The question was so unexpected that she answered it honestly before she could construct a more suitable reply. She had read Cowper's letters and 2 volumes of natural history, and had also, in the last hour before Ashwick, put both down and watched the landscape because it had seemed more useful to see where she was going than to distract herself from it. He had looked at her across the considerable distance of mahogany between them, and something in his expression had shifted by a fraction so small that she could not have named it, and he had said, "That was sensible." It was the same word Lady Portes had used, but in his mouth it carried a different weight. Not praise, exactly. Recognition. The household was small by the standards of an earldom. Mrs. Portman ran the domestic arrangements with quiet efficiency. Mr. Bale, the steward, arrived every Tuesday morning with ledgers and left 2 hours later with the Earl's instruction. There were a cook and a kitchen maid and 3 footmen and a groom. There was also a child. Cecily encountered her on the 3rd morning, in the long gallery that ran along the east wing. A girl of perhaps 7 years, with her father's gray eyes and dark hair worn in a plait that had been done and redone recently, as if by someone who understood the mechanics of a plait, but not its finer points. She was standing before a portrait of a woman in a blue dress, and staring at it with the concentrated grief of someone who has learned not to say the grief aloud. Her name was Harriet. She was the Earl's daughter by his first marriage, and her mother had died of a fever when Harriet was 4. The child looked at Cecily without the wariness one might have expected and said, with the peculiar directness of a child who has lived too long among adults, "Are you the lady who is to be my mother now?" Cecily crouched so that she was at Harriet's level. "I am to be your father's wife," she said. "Whether I am to be your mother is something you would know better than I do." Harriet appeared to consider this with genuine seriousness. "Mrs. Portman says you are sensible," the girl said at last. The word had now acquired the quality of a household verdict. There was a governess, a Miss Fenwick, who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and taught Harriet her Italian and her drawing. Harriet was competent at the Italian and extravagantly bad at the drawing, a fact she had arrived at a private peace with, having apparently decided that honest limitation was more tolerable than the performance of an aptitude she lacked. Cecily discovered this on a Thursday afternoon when she passed the schoolroom and heard Harriet saying with great composure, "I know it is not a tree, Miss Fenwick. I know what a tree looks like. The difficulty is that my hand does not." Cecily had stood in the corridor for a moment, and then moved on, and the small sound that escaped her before she managed to suppress it was the closest she had come to laughter in many weeks. She pressed her gloved hand against her mouth and breathed, and there was in the gesture not only the suppression of amusement, but the acknowledgment of it, the recognition that she had been moved to feel something she had not expected to feel in this house. She did not see the Earl standing at the far end of the corridor in the shadow of the turn. She did not see the particular quality of his stillness as he watched her press her gloved hand briefly against her mouth, and then straighten herself and walk on. She did not see the thing that crossed his face in the moment before he turned away, which was a stillness of a different order from his ordinary stillness, the stillness of a man who has just been reminded that the world contains more than he has been permitting himself to observe. She was not meant to see it. He had spent many months ensuring that no one saw such things, and he was practiced at it. He was practiced at many kinds of disappearance. The corridor was empty now except for the afternoon light, and he stood in it for a moment longer than was necessary, before he returned to the study where the ledgers were waiting with their reliable impersonality. He had married his first wife, Clara, out of genuine feeling. She had been a woman of great vivacity, and a constitutionally poor tolerance for the country, and she had spent the first 2 years of their marriage finding the estate beautiful, and the following 2 finding it airless. And then she had developed a fever in the 3rd week of October, and been dead by November. And Edmund Rabble had spent the 12 months following her death attempting to determine whether he grieved her, or whether he grieved the precise shape of his own failure to give her what she had needed before it was too late to give her anything at all. He had arrived at no satisfying answer to that question. He had put Clara's portrait in the long gallery and Harriet in the care of a sensible governess in the estate, in order with the kind of application that comes not from pleasure in the work, but from the understanding that disorder in outward things will not contain the disorder in inward ones. He had also, in the autumn of 1816, purchased the Vane debt from the original creditor, a fact that Mr. Throckton had presented to Cecil Vane as an arrangement of mutual convenience, and that Edmund had not, at the time, been prepared to examine too closely for its actual character. He had told himself it was expedient. He needed a mistress for the house, a presence for Harriet, a practical arrangement with a woman of good family and reduced circumstances, who would bring steadiness and competence, and a willingness to manage, without requiring to be told that she was managed. He had not admitted, even internally, that he had heard Cecil Vane describe his eldest daughter at a county assembly the previous summer, and had registered the description with a precision he could not entirely account for. Cecily Vane, her father had said, reads too much, and dances poorly, and has strong opinions about agricultural policy, which is unfortunate in a girl. Edmund had not thought it unfortunate. He did not allow himself to follow that thought to its conclusion. He had not allowed himself to follow such thoughts to their conclusions for a considerable number of years, and he was not about to stop now. The arrangement proceeded with propriety. He called on her each morning in the sitting room that had been designated for her use, and they spoke for 20 minutes or 30 minutes about the management of the household or the plans for the estate or the books she was reading. And he listened to her opinions with the focused attention of someone who had been told all his life that opinions from that quarter were not a matter of record, and who was privately revising his position on the subject. She was not merely sensible. She was precise in thought and direct in speech, and capable of occupying silence without filling it unnecessarily. And he had not met more than 3 people in his adult life who could do all 3 simultaneously. Their first genuine disagreement occurred on the matter of the home farm's drainage. Cecily had walked the north field with Mr. Doe Bale on a Tuesday morning, and returned to the sitting room with mud on her hem and a correction to an assumption that had been undisturbing the Earl's management plan for 2 years. She presented it without apology and without performance, simply as a fact she had encountered that the present plan did not adequately account for. Edmund looked at the sketch she had made in the margin of the map and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "You are right." There was a pause. She appeared to be waiting for a qualification, some reduction of the concession, that would restore the ordinary balance of such conversations. No reduction came. He looked up from the map and they regarded each other across the sitting room, and the air between them acquired for the first time a quality that was not simply the courtesy of 2 strangers attempting to inhabit the same house without inconveniencing each other. That evening after dinner, she played the pianoforte in the drawing-room. She played tolerably, without great feeling but without apology. And when she finished the first piece, she sat for a moment without moving, her hands still resting on the keys, looking at the candles on the music stand. She was not aware that he had moved from his chair until his voice came from the settee nearest the instrument. "Will you play the second movement?" She had not known he was listening so closely. She played the second movement. The arrangements for the wedding had been conducted largely by correspondence before her arrival, and the date was fixed for the 30th of April, 3 weeks hence. The banns had been called at the village church with the impersonal efficiency of a procedural matter, and the occasion was to be small, as befitted a second marriage and an arrangement born of practical necessity. It was to be attended by the solicitors and the household, and by Lady Portis, who had agreed to come from London for the occasion, on the understanding that she would offer her opinion of the Earl at supper, and that Cecily would listen to that opinion with appropriate seriousness. It was therefore a significant development when, on the 21st of April, 9 days before the wedding, the carriage belonging to Lord Vane arrived at Ashwick Hall with not only Cecily's father, but also her father's brother, Mr. Waterhas. Geoffrey Vane, who had apparently decided that the occasion required his presence. Cecily met them in the vestibule. Her uncle was a man of 50, with a kind of face that arranges itself very readily into an expression of proprietary authority, and he had deployed that expression to considerable effect in Derbyshire for a quarter of a century. And he deployed it now as he looked around the entrance hall of Ashwick, and arrived at a set of calculations whose character Cecily recognized immediately, and with a coldness in her chest that had nothing to do with the April air. "A handsome house," her uncle said. "Handsomer than I expected, considering the debt was what it was." "The debt has been settled," Cecily said. "Not yet, it is not," Geoffrey Vane said pleasantly. "The settlement is contingent on the marriage, and the marriage has not yet occurred." He said it as a man who has rehearsed the information and found it satisfying. Cecily's father stood a half-step behind his brother with the particular posture of a man who knows a mistake has been made and has decided to wait and see who will be required to admit it. The Earl received them in the library. Cecily sat beside the window with her hands in her lap and watched Edmund read Geoffrey Vane's face with the unhurried attention of a man who has dealt with a great many people who believe that the room belonged to them by virtue of walking into it. She had never before seen Edmund manage another person, and there was something instructive in observing it. He did not assume authority, he simply declined to surrender it, and the distinction expressed itself in small, precise acts. He said very little. He poured Madeira for Cecily's father, and then, after a very brief pause, did not pour any for Geoffrey Vane. And Geoffrey Vane, who had been reaching for the glass, redirected his hand with a smoothness that cost him something. Edmund did not acknowledge the gesture. He sat in the chair nearest the fire, and waited, with the manner of a man who has nowhere pressing to be, and is content to allow another's impatience to arrange itself into speech. What Geoffrey Vane wanted was straightforward, and he laid it out over the course of 20 minutes with the breezy fluency of a man accustomed to making propositions sound like gestures of generosity. The northern parcel of land adjacent to the Vane estate had come into a dispute of title and a small additional settlement, to be understood as a gesture of good faith between the families now being joined, would resolve the matter to everyone's comfort. It was extortion. It was extortion dressed in the language of familial warmth, which made it more disagreeable, not less. Edmund said, "I see." He set down his glass. "And if no such gesture of good faith is extended," Geoffrey Vane spread his hands, "it would be unfortunate for Miss Vane to have her position made uncertain at this particular juncture." The room was very quiet. Cecily said, before Edmund could speak, "My position, Mr. Rell. Vane is my own affair." Geoffrey Vane looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. She was accustomed to that expression. She had been producing it in her uncle for several years by the simple method of not agreeing with him. "A spirited girl," Geoffrey Vane said, with the comfortable condescension of a man who has decided that spirit in women is charming rather than authoritative. "She will need managing." The word landed in the silence. Edmund said, his voice very quiet, "You are describing your niece." "I am offering a practical observation," Geoffrey Vane said. "Women of strong opinion benefit from a firm hand. You will find she requires considerable management, my lord. You will thank me in time for the candor." Edmund looked at Cecily. It was a brief look, and she would not have been able to say afterwards exactly what it contained, only that it did not contain the agreement Geoffrey Vane was expecting. "My household," Edmund said, "is not in need of your observation, Mr. Vane. I am obliged for your journey, which must have been fatiguing. Mrs. Portman will arrange refreshment before you depart." The departure took another hour, during which Geoffrey Vane attempted 3 more approaches, and met each with a courteous immovability that gave him nothing to grip. Cecily's father said almost nothing, and when he finally stood to leave, he paused near the door and said, without quite meeting Cecily's eyes, "You are well here, then?" It was not quite a question. She answered it as if it were. "I am well," she said. He looked at his hands and then nodded, and went out. In the silence, after the carriage had gone, Cecily sat in the library for a long moment, and then became aware that Edmund had not left. He was standing near the desk with his back to the window, and the late afternoon light was behind him, and she could not see his face with great precision, but she could see that he was looking at her with the same full attention he had given her since the morning of her arrival. The attention that did not assess or catalog but simply acknowledged what it saw. "I am sorry," she said, because it seemed the thing to say, and because she meant it. "My uncle is a man who considers every room his. I did not anticipate that he would come." "You have nothing to apologize for," Edmund said. "The additional settlement he requested," she began, "will not be paid." She looked at him. "The marriage contract is contingent on the death settlement. If he attempts to complicate the terms," she began again. "Miss Vane." He crossed the room and stopped at a distance that was properly maintained, and that nonetheless felt, in the quiet of the library, like a proximity. His voice was the same quiet it had always been, but something in it was different, as if a door that had been held firmly shut had moved, not opened, but moved. "The contract will proceed as written. The debt is settled as far as I am concerned. Your uncle's opinion of what constitutes good faith is not mine." She held very still. The fire crackled behind her. Somewhere in the house, a long way off, she could hear Harriet being called in for supper by Mrs. Portman. "He will make difficulties," Cecily said. "Men like your uncle depend on the belief that difficulties, when they are made, will produce compliance," Edmund said. "I have not found this to be the case." She was looking at his face. The gray eyes were steady, as they always were, but there was something in their steadiness now that she had not seen before, or perhaps had not allowed herself to see. And it was the something that had no adequate word in the vocabulary of arrangement and convenience and mutual practical benefit, and it frightened her in the way that things which have not yet acquired a name are always frightening. "You are very kind," she said at last, because it was true, and because it was the only word she trusted herself with at that moment. He did not dispute the word. He said, very quietly, "You are not what I expected either." She did not ask what he had expected. She did not need to. The next morning she found Harriet in the schoolroom before Miss Fenwick arrived, sitting at the table with a sheet of paper, and a great deal of concentrated determination. Cecily sat down opposite her and looked at the drawing, which was of a house, or what Harriet intended to be a house, with a great deal of optimism applied to the windows. "It is Ashwick," Harriet said without looking up. "I am making it for your wedding morning." Cecily looked at the house and its resolute windows and felt something move through her chest that was not grief, and was not the particular stoic resignation she had been carrying for several months, and was, in fact, something she had not had occasion to feel in long enough that she had almost forgotten it had a name. "It is very fine," she said. Harriet looked up. "You are being kind," the girl said with her father's directness. "I am being accurate," Cecily said, and meant it. The morning of the 30th of April arrived, gray and mild, with a soft quality of light that suggested the sun was present behind the clouds, even if it had decided not to make a demonstration of itself. Lady Portis had arrived the previous evening and had taken one look at the Earl across the supper table, and had said quietly to Cecily in the corridor afterwards, "He watches you." "He is attentive to the household," Cecily had said. Lady Portis had given her the particular look of a woman who has been navigating the gap between what is said and what is true for 55 years, and finds it restful to stop. "He watches you," she had repeated, and said nothing further on the subject. The ceremony at the village church of St. Giles was attended by Lady Portis and Mr. Bale and Mrs. Metzer. Portman and Harriet, in her best muslin, and the 3 footmen, and Mr. Ty Throckton, who had arrived from London for the procedural confirmation, with the satisfied expression of a man who regards a completed contract as the highest aesthetic experience available. Geoffrey Vane had not come. He had sent a letter that had been brief and pointed, and Edmund had read it at breakfast, and then set it aside with the composed finality of a man who has decided that a letter has been adequately addressed by the act of reading it. The church smelled of cold stone and candle wax and the first green breath of spring coming through the side door someone had left ajar. Cecily stood beside Edmund at the altar and looked at the vicar and listened to the words of the service with the precision of a person determined to hear every syllable clearly. And when the moment came, she said what she was required to say in a voice that did not waver, and Edmund said what he was required to say in his same quiet, level voice. And the ring he placed on her finger was plain gold, and slightly warm from his coat pocket, and she wondered, very briefly, and with a precision she could not help, how long it had been in that pocket before this morning. There was a wedding breakfast at the house, modest and very good, and Lady Portis ate 2 portions of the lobster patties and told Edmund at some length that Cecily had read everything in her father's library before she was 18, and Edmund said that he was aware she had read considerably. And Lady Portis looked at him again with the same calibrating expression, and arrived at some private conclusion that produced, in her, a small nod of a very particular kind. Harriet gave Cecily the drawing in the vestibule after Lady Portis had departed. It had been folded once, and unfolded, and the fold showed, and the windows of the house had been inked over and were now more decisive than before. "I added the door," Harriet said, "so it looks more like a house where people are at home." Cecily received the drawing with both hands. In the weeks that followed, the house began to change in the way that houses do when they are inhabited with genuine intention, rather than managed from a careful distance. Cecily had the north-facing sitting room's curtains replaced with ones that admitted more light. She arranged for Harriet's drawing lessons to be supplemented with lessons in watercolor, on the theory that the medium was more forgiving, and that Harriet's relationship with accuracy might be improved by a medium that rewarded the impression rather than the fact. She walked the home farm with Mr. Bale, and then presented the revised drainage plan to Edmund on the following Tuesday in such a way that its adoption felt like a natural consequence of existing good sense rather than a correction of prior error. Edmund adopted it. He also on the same Tuesday showed her the estate books for the first time, without being asked, and sat beside her at the library table while she read through them, and when she arrived at a figure that did not resolve cleanly, he handed her the supplementary ledger before she had asked for it, as if he had been expecting the moment. She looked at his hands on the ledger. They were careful hands, precise, with a small scar along the edge of the left thumb from what looked like an old riding accident. She had not noticed the scar before, which meant she had not yet noticed everything, and this thought produced in her a peculiar quality of attention, the feeling of a room in which there were more doors than she had so far opened. "Your uncle has written again," Edmund said. "I know," she said. "I have written back." He looked at her. "What did you write?" "I told him that the settlement was complete, that the terms were not subject to revision, and that any further correspondence on the subject would be directed to Mr. Throckton." She paused. "I also told him that I was well, and that Ashwick was a handsome house, and that I had found in my husband a man of greater worth than he had led me to expect." The silence was very complete. "You told him that," Edmund said. "I did," she said. It was true. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned low. Outside the library window, the last light of the May evening was doing something very particular to the stone of the terrace, turning it gold in the way that English light sometimes accomplishes in the hour before it goes. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "My first wife," he said. "She found this house difficult. She was a woman of considerable feeling, and very little tolerance for quiet, and I thought for a long time that I had failed her by bringing her somewhere she could not flourish." He was looking at the fire. "I have been, since then, very careful not to bring anyone into a situation they had not fully chosen." "I chose this," Cecily said. "You did not choose it," he said, with the precision of someone who insists on accuracy, even when accuracy is painful. "Your father chose it, and the debt chose it, and I chose it, in a manner that was not entirely transparent about its own motives. You accepted what you were given. I came to Ashwick Hall," she said, "with my plainest gowns and my mother's earrings, and a very clear understanding that I was solving a problem. What I found was not a problem and not a solution. What I found was a household and a child and a man who knelt to light my fire on the first morning and asked me what I had read on the journey and listened to the answer as if it mattered. She stopped. It is not what I expected. He turned from the fire and looked at her with the gray eyes that were always steady, and that were now also something else, something that had the quality of a thing held at length being set down at last. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had said Miss Vane on the day of her arrival, and Lady Ashwick at the church, and she had not quite realized until this moment that neither of those had been her name in his voice. She felt the warmth of it move through her, like light through a curtain. "I do not know how to do this easily," he said. "I am not a man who does things easily. I find, however, that I wish to try." She looked at him across the library table and the ledgers in the last of the evening light, and she thought of the drawing Harriet had made with its decisive windows, the door inked in so it looked like a house where people are at home. And she understood for the first time that the drawing was not a representation of what Ashwick was, but of what Harriet understood it was becoming. "Then, try," she said. He rose from the chair. He crossed the room with the deliberate, unhurried movement that was entirely his own, and he stopped before her and took her gloved hand from the table, and he held it between both of his with the careful attention of someone who understands that what they are holding is fragile, not because it is weak, but because it matters. He did not say anything further for a moment. He looked at her hand in his, and she looked at the side of his face in the last of the light. The jaw she had once thought severe, and now understood was simply the face of a man who had learned not to spend what he had not yet earned. "You are not what I expected either," she said, because she had said it before in her mind and not yet aloud, and it seemed important to say it now in the room where he could hear it. She had not expected to be moved by the pressing of his lips to the back of her gloved hand. She had not expected the quality of steadiness that radiated from him in proximity, the sense of a thing that would not be rushed, and would not be careless and would not set her down, unless she asked to be put down. She had not expected to feel in the quiet of the library at Ashwick Hall on a May evening that the word home was beginning to refer to something it had not previously referred to, and that this was not a loss, but a recovery of something she had not quite known she was missing. If Cecily's quiet courage has moved you tonight, leave a thought in the comments. She earned every moment of this. Geoffrey Vane made one final attempt in June. He arrived without notice, which was the tactic of a man who believes that surprise is the same as advantage, and he was received in the vestibule by Mrs. Portman, who informed him that Lord and Lady Ashwick were not at home to unannounced callers, a fact delivered with the serene authority of a woman who has been managing large houses for 30 years and is not remotely interested in the opinion of men who do not announce themselves. He sent a letter to Edmund the following day, this time dropping the language of familial warmth and speaking plainly of what he believed he was owed, which was a great deal, and all of it without basis. Edmund brought the letter to Cecily, which was not something he had done before with his correspondence, and she read it at the breakfast table with her tea cooling beside her, and then set it down with the care she gave to things she intended to handle without excessive emotion. "He believes that your compliance in this matter is contingent on my comfort," she said. "He has misunderstood the situation," Edmund said. "He has," she agreed. She looked at him across the breakfast table. "If I write to Mr. Throckton and request that he make the terms of the settlement formally public, as they pertain to my father's house, Geoffrey Vane loses the one ambiguity he has been using as a lever. There is nothing to renegotiate if there is nothing unclear." Edmund looked at her. "It will be a public document. My uncle has been trading on the assumption that we prefer quiet to exposure," she said. "That assumption is his only tool." There was a pause. Then Edmund said, "Write to Throckton." She wrote that afternoon, at the writing desk in the sitting room with the curtains. She had replaced, and the letter she produced was clear and specific, and left nothing undefined. And when she sealed it, she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that has been made clean. Mr. Throckton's formal response reached Geoffrey Vane within 10 days, and the silence from that direction thereafter was the silence of a man who has arrived at the limit of his leverage and discovered it to be the end of a short road. The summer came in gently over the Somerset hills, and the home farm's revised drainage held against the June rains with the quiet satisfaction of a good plan, meeting the weather it was designed for. Harriet's watercolors improved to the point where one of them, an attempt at the rose garden seen from the library window, was recognizable as a rose garden if one knew what one was looking for and approached the subject with good will. Edmund hung it in the library, not near the window from which it had been painted, but on the wall beside the door, in a place he would see it every time he entered the room. Harriet noticed this and said nothing. She had the discretion of a child who has learned that some things are more significant when they are allowed to speak for themselves. In the evenings, Cecily played the pianoforte, and Edmund sat near the instrument and read or did not read, and the music moved through the drawing room and into the quiet of the house beyond. The particular quality of the silence between them was no longer the silence of two strangers being careful not to inconvenience each other, but the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere together and found it sufficient. On a Thursday evening in late August, with the windows open and the smell of the garden coming in on the warm air, Edmund set down the book he had not been reading and said, "I am glad you came." She lifted her hands from the keys and turned on the bench and looked at him. He was not a man who said such things easily, which meant that he had said it because he meant it, and because he had decided that, meaning it was enough to justify the saying. "I am glad I came," she said. There was nothing else required. The evening pressed in around them, warm and ordinary and entirely theirs, and in the rose garden beyond the window, the last of the summer's light was doing the thing it did in August, that specific late-day gold that the English countryside seems to save, for the moments when it is most worth having, and the drawing that Harriet had made of Ashwick Hall, with its decided windows and its inked-in door, was 3 rooms away in Edmund's library on the wall beside the entrance. And the marriage that had begun as a debt and a document had become, by the particular alchemy of small, consistent, truthful things, exactly what neither of them had known to ask for, which was a home, named, warm, and kept.